going to dispel some myths, probably. The first one being warm temperatures delay the rut. I feel like I hear this every year. And another one that I hear is that big bucks, like the one in this picture, breed all of the does. They're the dominant deer. Moon phase could determine the rut. I've heard that before. And then that the peak rut is in, maybe you've heard it's in November, maybe you've heard it's in October, maybe September. So we're going to touch on all of this and more. So first, we're going to talk about how the rut actually works and why it works that way. And then we're going to go over a history of white-tailed deer in the southeastern United States, because that's going to it'll impact a lot of our understanding of the rut. And then some ways, some tips and tricks that you can use this new knowledge to your advantage in the field. So we're going to start with biology. In most animals, hormones drive most things, right? And deer are no exception. So the big hormone, well, the big thing that drives hormones in deer is photoperiod or day length. So the amount of daylight determines how much testosterone, or how much melatonin, excuse me, an animal produces. So melatonin kind of builds and builds as the day length gets shorter as we go into the fall. And when it reaches a critical mass, it kind of flips a switch, so to speak, in the deer's brain, which then goes to the pituitary gland, and testosterone is upregulated. So you can see my nice little diagram here of the sun and the earth. And obviously that rotation is what drives our seasons and day length. So temperature really doesn't have anything to do with it. Although climate change could, I guess, there could be an interplay there. So as testosterone goes up, the sex organs enlarge, and the production of everything associated with that goes up. So something interesting to think about here is that in the tropics, where day length doesn't change very much, deer can pretty much breed year-round. And actually, deer can breed year-round in the southeast as well. It's very rare, but even when their sex organs are not enlarged, so when they're still atrophied outside of season, you could say they can still breed, but they don't have the drive to do so, and females are also not receptive at that time. Okay, but why does deer sex rely on day length? Like, what's the logic behind this? Well, if we think about it in an evolutionary context, day length coincides with resource availability as you move away from the equator. So as you move towards the North or the South Pole, the longer the days are, you could think of it that way, there's going to be more food on the landscape. So you want fawns to be born at the exact right time so that there's enough food for them. But you don't want them to be born too early in northern latitudes, because then they could freeze and die. So you want them to be born as early as possible, but not too soon. And that's how evolution has selected for these very narrow breeding windows, what you can think of as peak rut. And here in the South, as you can imagine, the costs aren't so great for being born outside of a very narrow window, because there's a little bit more food on the landscape during the winter, and it doesn't get quite as cold, in this early spring. So southern deer breed anytime. This is a rut map depicting the peak rut dates for Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. And this is a very busy graphic. I don't want you to focus too much on the details of it, but just know that each color on the map coincides with a different peak rut date or window of dates. So this is nuts. I mean, you can see in Mississippi, all of those tiny little bands that are close together. This is not explained by the things that I just told you. This is not explained by day length, because obviously the day length between North Mississippi and South or Middle Mississippi is not that different. So we're going to talk about why this is the way it is, but I would like to back up and ask, how do we know this information? How do we know when peak conception which you could also call peak rut dates, actually are. Well, in the instance of these 3 states in this map, the state wildlife agencies conduct what are called herd health checks. So basically, biologists go out at night and harvest a certain number of deer, typically does, and they'll take a bunch of health metrics on them. So they'll measure things like kidney fat and, they can survey for parasites or whatever maybe the agency is wanting to look for, has concerns about at that time. But the other thing they do is they take out any fetuses that the doe has conceived and they measure them. And over time, there have been what are called fetal growth curves developed. So based on the nose to tail length of the fetus, you can backdate its conception date. So that's how we have all of this information for these 3 states. Not every state does this. I think primarily this is something that is unique to the Southeast because there is so much variation geographically in peak rut, whereas in like Minnesota and Wisconsin, the rut is going to be pretty close across the whole state. So as I said, we need to talk about the history of deer in the Southeast, kind of what got us to where we are. Long ago, I'd say in the late 1800s, early 1900s, whitetail deer were almost extirpated from much of the Southeast. So they were hunted and to some degree habitat degradation, but really they were overexploited to the point of being almost non-existent. So in the 40s, which I believe is when this photo is from, this is a photo from the Georgia DNR. In the 40s, they started restocking them. So they took deer from a lot of different states. Virginia got deer from 11 states, and you can see that Florida, Georgia, Arkansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia, all of those states got hundreds of deer from Wisconsin. Mississippi got at least 72 deer from Mexico, as well as deer from New York, Wisconsin, I think West Virginia. And then Florida, Louisiana, and Georgia got between 167 and over 1,000 deer from Texas, depending on the state that you're talking about. So all of this is to say, deer in the Southeast are a mashup of deer from across their entire range. And so there are a lot of remnant genetics from a lot of different places. Now, you might be asking yourself, aren't genes changing over time? Well, it's true that genetics are not static, but interestingly enough, it seems like the priming mechanism for the rut is something that's passed down on the chromosome from the doe, from the dam. So we would call that a matrilineal priming mechanism. It's passed down through females, and does, as you probably know, have what we call a higher site fidelity. So they kind of stick around the place that they're born. They grow up and oftentimes can be seen still living in association with their mother or other female relatives. So the combination of it being passed down through females and females not generally traveling very far from where they're born is what's kind of holding these genes in place for is what's kind of holding these determinants in place genetically for when the rut should start. All right, so now that you know what determines the rut, let's just go over basic mating biology of whitetail deer. So a doe is going to be receptive when she comes into estrus, and her estrus lasts just about a day. If she's not bred, it can last up to a little more than 2 days, maybe 3 days. And if she's not bred, she'll cycle again in 21 days. So pretty similar to a person. I mean, a person doesn't need to come into heat to be bred, but you understand what I'm saying. Their cycle is similar to a human woman's. And interestingly enough, age and body condition determine who's going to breed first. So older does are generally heavier. They're a little bit more dominant. So they will be bred before younger does. And actually, a doe's sexual maturity, the age at which she reaches sexual maturity, is based on her body weight. So in places where there's not a lot of nutrition, not a lot of food on the ground, It may take a doe, she may have to be a year and a half old or 2.5 years old before she can breed. Whereas in places that have a lot of food, a doe could breed as a fawn. So when she's about 6 months old, that's rare, but and so in the Southeast, herd demographics, more so than the weather, are really what influence breeding. So in a situation where you have a lot of does in comparison to the number of bucks, it can really prolong the breeding season, right? Because does will come into their first estrus, and if there's not enough bucks, they won't all get bred. So then you have to wait 21 days for the remainder to be bred. And if, again, they don't all get bred because there's still not enough bucks, you could have them cycling 21 days after that. So it can really spread out the breeding season. All right, so what are males going through during this time? Well, as you all, I'm sure, have seen, right now, let's see. Right now, in a lot of places, velvet is done for or coming to a close. But bucks have been growing antlers all summer long, so they've been covered in that vascularized velvet layer, which is moving nutrients all around it to the antlers and allowing them to grow. And it gets itchy once the antlers are hardened, and so bucks try to rub it off. And so once that starts happening, they start sparring with each other. And a lot of times, bucks will live in what we call bachelor groups outside of the rut. So they're kind of hanging out together anyway, and they'll start sparring. Yearlings, especially, so 1.5-year-old deer, really enjoy sparring, and they'll initiate a lot of these sparring bouts. And this you can think of basically like play. It's not intense, it's nobody's getting hurt. But as testosterone levels rise, the intensity goes up a little bit. Now, violent dominance fights are actually really rare. I would be surprised if anyone on this call has seen this before. I've spent a lot of time in the woods just trying to catch deer outside of hunting season, and I have never seen this. So this really only happens if there's two unfamiliar bucks that encounter one another, or if they're in like a direct contest over a doe that's ready to be bred. And this can result in injury and sometimes death. So another behavior that's worth noting during the rut, especially from a hunter's perspective, is signpost communication. Basically, bucks go around anointing the woods with secretions from different glands. So in this photo, you can see this buck is rubbing on this tree secretions from his forehead gland. And it seems like the species they select for signposts are often aromatic species like pines, cherries, and cedars. Presumably this helps amplify the scent or helps attract other deer to that spot to then pick up on the scent. Interestingly enough, older bucks make a lot more of these rubs. So it could be 300 to 400 every fall. Does and bucks respond to rubs that are in general less than 3 days old. So I want you to keep this in mind when you're thinking about when you see a rub in the woods. And I know, like for me, when I first started hunting, I would see that and think, I need to camp out here. But really, they go bad, so to speak, they expire. So it would be more beneficial probably to try to find an area that had a lot of rubs in it or in the close vicinity and try to set up shop there. Bucks also have a gland in between their two front toes called their interdigital gland. And you'll see them pawing the ground, scrapes, a lot of times they're called. They'll paw the ground, leave some scent from that gland, and then a lot of times also urinate there to leave their scent. And there are traditional rubs and non-traditional rubs. So traditional rubs would be something that bucks come back to every year. Multiple bucks could use the same traditional rub, but in exploited herds or herds that are hunted quite a bit, especially where the buck age structure is younger because there's a lot of them that are being harvested, traditional rubs are less important and a lot less common. So if you have a lot of young bucks and not many old bucks, or if you have a really large number of does in proportion to the number of bucks, this kind of communication may not be as important. So all of the information, or the vast majority of it that I'm going to share with you today, you're going to have to try and take home and apply to your own situation. So if you're hunting public land that's really heavily exploited and there's not a lot of older deer, you want to take that into account when thinking about how all of this could help you. The converse is also true. If you're hunting private land that's really well managed, intensively managed, and it does have a lot of mature bucks on it, then you could benefit from knowing where some traditional rubs are. And the take-home message here is that it's more complicated than just pouring some doe pee on the ground or at the base of your stand and hoping that a buck is going to sniff that and make his way to you. During the rut, actually leading up to the rut and during the rut, both males and females increase what we call their home range size. So the area that they cover basically in their travels. Bucks more so than does. And interestingly enough, during my graduate research, I found that there's not really a one size fits all when it comes to this. Basically, what I saw was 3 types of movement during the rut. So I had GPS collars on, all told, about 100 mature bucks, and they would bebop around, they'd be living their life. And then as the rut came to a head, they would do one of 3 things. Some of them did nothing. They basically stayed in the same spot. Another group traveled to kind of a second focal area. So they had like 2 places where they would spread out and hang out, and then just a thin travel corridor between the 2. And this could be, they could be a mile from each other, or they could be, 4 miles from each other. One deer went on a crazy 13-mile spree. But so some deer just hung out tight. Some deer had 2 spots that they went back and forth between. And then the third group of deer just kind of exploded and really did cover a lot more ground. And this wasn't really predicated upon age of the deer. It seemed to be, to my eyes, a product of their personality, their individual personality. So fun fact there. All right, so when a buck actually does locate a doe, they form what we call a tending bond. And so this is different than, like, if you're going to think about elk or some other mating systems where one male kind of gathers up a bunch of females and guards them. That is not what happens in whitetail deer. It's a one-on-one situation. So the buck doesn't have a territory. The definition of a territory would be defending an area of land. Bucks do not do that. They will defend an estrus doe that they are tending, but the tending bond doesn't last very long. It lasts about 3 days, sometimes only 1 day. And part of the reason that it's theorized that whitetail deer have this system rather than a harem system is because if you think about the types of places that whitetail deer are found where they live, generally it's pretty dense vegetation. So it would be pretty tough for a buck to find a bunch of does, gather them together, and defend them from other males. So they've evolved this system instead. So there's first a courtship phase. This happens when the bachelor groups I mentioned before start to dissolve, bucks start to go out on their own. If a buck comes across a doe, a lot of times she'll urinate, and he will actually take up the urine in his mouth and it'll enter into his, I'm not going to pronounce it right, but there's openings actually in, the next time you harvest a deer, if you look at its skull, they've got little openings in the base of their palate. And so he takes the urine up into the veromonasal opening, I think is what it's called, and performs what's called phlegmon, which is the behavior, you may have seen a horse do it. It's where they stick their nose up in the air and they really kind of snort through it. And we know they do this and we really don't know why. Sometimes people think that maybe it's a way to make sure that both the buck and the doe are in peak breeding condition. So he may be sensing something through that that's signaling to him that she's ready to go, or maybe it's signaling, it's causing something in his body to change to make sure that he's primed. We don't know. But anyway, if the doe is not receptive, so she's not in estrus, she'll run away from the buck. If she is receptive, she'll stand for him, and then they'll be kind of bonded for the next few days, and then the buck is on to the next one. So it's a short relationship. But one thing to note here is that does actually have been shown to exhibit mate choice. So for a long time, it was thought that does just, if they were in estrus and there was a buck there, they just stood for whoever was there. But actually during my time in graduate school, one of my lab mates demonstrated that does do choose, and lo and behold, they prefer big antlers. So size does matter, interestingly enough. Now, if there is only one buck there and she doesn't have anyone to choose from, maybe she would just breed with him. But all right, so who is breeding? It's not just the old quote unquote dominant bucks. Interestingly enough, a buck that's very successful might produce up to 9 offspring per year. That's like the max. So it's not one big daddy that's going out and breeding all the does. 3.5 years old and older deer sire roughly 70% of fawns. So that means the remaining 30% of fawns that are born every year are sired by 1.5 old or 2.5-year-old deer. Even in populations that have a very balanced age structure with an appropriate number of old bucks, middle-aged bucks, and young bucks. And interestingly enough, the way that they do this isn't necessarily by outcompeting mature bucks in direct contests, but by loitering on the periphery and the fringes of these tending bonds. And I'm sorry if you can hear my baby, she's upset right now. But basically, they just kind of hang out on the edge. I mentioned before that the dense vegetation that deer live in, and then they just slide in there whenever they get the opportunity, and it works. So as I mentioned before, females do choose, and sometimes I guess they choose the young buck. And this is a really fun fact. Most of you or all of you probably know that whitetail deer typically produce twins when they fawn, and 1/4 of fawn pairs have multiple paternities. So 25% of all the pregnancies, basically you think about that does have, are sired by multiple deer. So that means she was bred by multiple deer during that 1 to 3 day estrus. So unfortunately, not everyone survives the rut. Bucks don't eat a lot during this time. As I'm sure you know, their primary goal, especially in peak rut, is to breed does, so they can lose a lot of body weight. And in general, kind of across the board, the rule of thumb is that 10% of your bucks are going to die from rut-related causes. So whether it's direct injury from fighting, or malnourishment, contributing to parasite loads and then just being more susceptible to other forms of disease. Could also be that they're traveling more, so they're crossing roads and encountering, getting hit by cars more. Interestingly, testosterone is an immune suppressant, so there's kind of a lot working against them during the rut. And this actually is a video. Let me see if I can get it to play. This is a video of one of my study deer, deer 251, looks like. So he's wearing a GPS collar. I put ear tags in all of my deer too, so we could identify them on trail camera photos. But this is a video I took with my cell phone. We got a signal from his collar that he was dead. So basically the collar would send a signal if it didn't move for, I can't remember if it was 8 or 13 hours. I had to play with it a little bit. So we had some lazy deer that would just lay around for a long time. But if it didn't move, it had a sensor on it and it would send us a signal. So we went in thinking that we would find him dead. And instead, you can see it's dark, it's nighttime, it was early evening, probably 8:30 at night. We walked up and we're not far from that deer, 10 or 15 yards, and just standing there. We weren't making a lot of noise, but we were showing, the light from the camera and stuff. And he was pretty messed up, as you can see. And let's see if I can get hold on one second here. So that deer, this deer, he didn't make it, but more than maybe 4 more days. And you can see here where his skull sutures are. You can see hopefully you can see it, the really big gap right here. What had happened was, is that in fighting, he had cracked his skull plates and got a brain abscess. So he was a zombie deer at the point. Sorry, I've got a rattlesnake skin in there that I found. He was a zombie deer at that point when we videotaped him, kind of a dead man walking. Not that we knew that. But yeah, I found him eventually and it was green pus coming out of there. So that can happen. I had a few other direct mortalities happen where one deer got stabbed. It was a complete puncture wound in the neck. And I just think this is interesting because a lot of deer management focuses on cultivating mature bucks and, keeping them safe, protecting them, not harvesting them as a 2.5 or a 3.5-year-old. And not that that's a bad thing to do, but there's just no guarantees. Okay, so how can you use your knowledge of deer behavior in hunting? Well, unfortunately, it's not that exciting. A lot of the traditional ways that we already know about. You want to key in on feeding areas. I know I mentioned that bucks don't spend a lot of time in pursuit of food during the rut, but does still do, and bucks are looking for does. So you can still use feeding areas and if you want to harvest a doe, obviously, they taste better than bucks. You can also look for bedding sites, travel corridors. So if you find, a place that has some really high quality food, and then you find adjacent to that some good cover for bedding, and there's kind of a natural corridor, that would be a great place to set up at because they're going to be traveling back and forth daily between those two. Or congregation areas. That's probably more of a thing in more northern latitudes where there's snow and deer have to kind of conserve their energy that way. You, of course, want to watch the wind. Deer have excellent sense of scent, sense of smell. They can scent you easily. So you want to play the wind. You want to definitely minimize your movement. And as part of that, you want to be concealed. So it's good to wear camouflage. Don't wear blue. Deer can see blue. Other colors don't seem to be that big of a deal. But movement, interestingly enough, the way that vision works in deer is, see if I can describe this well. Basically, they see things like they're happening in slow-mo, kind of. So if you make a movement, like I make this movement with my hand, I see it like this. A deer basically just has more time to see the same movement because of the way that their eyes work. I am not an ocular specialist. I don't know how to talk about all the rods and the cones and how everything works in there, but essentially they get more snapshots per second or millisecond. And so it's just easier for them to see movement than it is for us. So even a tiny movement on your part can look really obvious to a deer. And anybody that's ever been busted by a deer can attest to this, I'm sure. So rattling antlers is something that a lot of people like to do. The volume, interestingly, matters a lot more than how long you do it for. So you want to do it really loudly, but you don't need to do it for a long time. That's not really going to matter. And the timing, so what stage of the rut you're in, is going to kind of dictate who responds more to that rattling. So we talk about peak rut. It's not well defined. But if you think back to those rut maps that we looked at, there's generally like a 2-week time period where the vast majority of conceptions are happening. So we could think about that as peak rut. And then on either side of that, you would have, like pre-rut and then either late or post-rut. So in the post-rut phase, you can think about that as after the frenzy. Mature bucks are going to respond more to antler rattling, whereas on the beginning, you're going to get younger bucks responding more frequently to antler rattling. I don't know if maybe the young bucks are tired of getting their butts kicked by the end of the rut. Maybe that's why they respond more during the early part. I don't know. But yeah, you can think about that. And even though there's a lot of different things marketed as being, a lot of different scents marketed as being attractive to deer, specifically bucks. So I'm thinking like doe urine here, there's synthetic doe urine, there's also actual doe urine that's collected on breeding farms that you can buy and spread around. Don't condone that because of CWD that's spread through urine. So it just doesn't seem smart to go pouring that around. But the evidence that in and of itself is even very attractive to bucks or any other deer is really not substantiated. So I would probably save my money. Well, I would save my money. I don't buy this stuff. But there's just not a lot of evidence that urine, even from a doe that's cycling, is enough to pull in a buck, because there's a lot of different things that go into a buck finding a doe, right? Like the signpost communication we talked about, and a lot of other things. Some deer may they may find a mate in the relative same geographic area every year. There could be, some component of memory that way, that plays into it. So anyway. So in summary, there's a lot of things that impact breeding, but herd demographics is a big one. So if you have a balanced sex ratio, where you have plenty of bucks to breed all the does when they come into their first estrus, you're going to have a tighter rut window. If you have a lot of does and not enough bucks to breed them, they're not going to all get bred on their first or maybe even second estrus, and that's going to prolong the breeding season. Genetic origins play a big role into when the rut happens, for different very localized areas in the Southeast. So we talked about potentially the priming mechanism for the rut in males being passed down through their mothers, and then does not really leaving the place where they're born. So those genetics are kind of holding strong. And then the age and body condition of the does, like we talked about, older, bigger does are going to breed first, followed by younger, smaller does as the season goes on. And I didn't put really any citations in this presentation because a lot of what I pulled, aside from what's just hanging out in my brain, came out of this book. And I highly recommend anybody who's interested in the slightest in white-tailed deer to buy this book. It's expensive. It's basically a textbook, but it's got just a ton of great information in it. Some of it is a little bit dated. There's some things I talked about in the presentation that are mentioned in the book as being not known. And since then, there's been studies to confirm or deny them. But for the most part, it's a great resource.